Well, here we go with The Perfect Storm, Part 5. In the second part of The Perfect Storm, we're going to look at a period of history between 1919 and 1939 marked by turmoil. As Europe struggled to recover from the devastation of the First World War and the destabilizing effects of the loss of a number of stable governments. The victors of the Great War failed to establish the conditions necessary for the world to progress into the future peacefully and successfully. The Roaring Twenties, a period of considerable prosperity, mostly benefited the United States. But this changed dramatically with the onset of the Great Depression. The main institution intended to bring stability was the League of Nations, with the intention of maintaining world security, peace, and encouraging economic growth between member countries. However, the League grew increasingly weak due to a lack of participation by the United States and the Soviet Union, and the world destabilized with the rise of dictatorships and authoritarian rule in countries such as Italy, Germany, Spain, and Japan. So, over the next few videos, we're going to look at an age of anxiety, the rise of communism, the rise of fascism, and nationalist movements. But first, we're going to look at an age of anxiety with the failure of the Paris Peace Conference. Now, in this image, you see the Big Four. From left to right, you see David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Vittorio Orlando, Prime Minister of Italy, Georges Clemenceau, Prime Minister of France, and Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States of America. A series of treaties were signed at the Paris Peace Conference, but the most important was the Versailles Treaty, signed in the Hall of Mirrors in 1919. Woodrow Wilson had earlier promoted his 14 points to establish a more stable future and to bring an end to the war in what he referred to as a peace without victory. And while the Germans, represented by the Weimar Republic, surrendered under the impression the 14 points would be followed through, many of the Allies, especially the French, wanted retribution. According to Clemenceau, Prime Minister of France, war is a series of catastrophes that results in a victory. Now, the most important of the 14 points were number 1, no secret treaties, so all countries could be aware of existing alliances and so forth. Number 2, freedom of the seas, so blockades would not occur in the future, preventing widespread shortages and starvation. Number 3, the removal of all economic barriers, promoting free trade. Number 4, a reduction of armed forces to spend more resources on progress and peace as opposed to defense and war. Number 5, a fair adjustment of the colonies and the eventual pursuit of self-determination. And skipping forward to Wilson's most prized goal was the formation of a general association of states in what would become the League of Nations, the precursor to today's United Nations. Seeking retribution, the Allies, and especially the French, proceeded to tear away at the 14 points. And even though most of the points were not followed, Wilson acquiesced time after time to keep his precious League of Nations. Germany was the hardest hit, being forced to massively reduce their armed forces, losing land along their borders and all their overseas colonies. They also had to assume full responsibility for the war and its damages through the War Guilt Clause, and they were forced to pay an enormous indemnity, or war debt. This indemnity helped to instigate massive stagflation in Germany, which is massive inflation coupled with massive unemployment, rendering the economy stagnant and unable to immediately improve. This chart compares the value of the German mark with that of the dollar between 1914 and November 1923. As it took more and more marks to equal a dollar, the purchasing power of each mark plummeted. You can see how the inflation began after World War I and then skyrocketed to over 1 trillion% in 1923. German currency became virtually useless. People needed whole suitcases or wheelbarrows full of money to even pay for small debts. Finally, in November, the government stabilized the currency at the rate of 1 trillion old marks to 1 new mark. Now, this cartoon was created incredibly in 1920. Of note, there was a small child with a copy of the treaty behind him. Above his head is a comment, 1940 class, predicting that the next generation would pay for the short-sightedness of the leaders of the nations at Versailles, who were seen walking past. And I scanned these remarkable stamps from a student years ago, showing the increasing inflation throughout 1923. Note that some numbers have been stamped over due to massive price increases. While the Congress of Vienna was largely successful in achieving its goals, the Paris Peace Conference has been viewed as an abject failure. It extended hatred instead of patching up the wounds between rival nations. This was no peace with honor. It was especially unfair to the Germans who would seek their own revenge years later. Even Italy, one of the big four, left the conference early and in disgust after they failed to receive as much land and compensation as they thought they deserved. And Russia, who was engaged in a communist takeover, wasn't invited to the conference at all. It's no surprise that authoritarian dictatorships would eventually arise in each of these countries. These new boundaries and countries created new problems and tensions that would lead to nationalist struggles over territory in the future. And furthermore, the United States never even joined the League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson tried to convince Congress to agree to it. However, after losing over 50,000 Americans in the Great War, the US followed a policy of isolationism. And this was largely possible due to geography. Isolationism was possible because the United States was protected on both sides by vast oceans. Wilson traveled the US on a campaign to convince people to urge Congress to join, but he suffered a stroke while on his tour, and the majority of US citizens chose to stay away from entangling alliances that could pull them into another global conflict. But without the United States, the League of Nations was truly limited. The best estimates put the number of total casualties around 37 million, with around 10 million dead soldiers. It was the first war in which more soldiers died from battle wounds rather than from disease and infection, in part due to scientific advancements, but also due to the way in which the war was fought. Additionally, around 7 million civilians perished, and that's excluding the influenza pandemic. As far as the social loss, it is truly incalculable. The veterans of the war were often regarded as a lost generation. As told by the book All Quiet on the Western Front, the conflict left a generation of men who, even though they may have escaped shells, were destroyed by the war.